When we saw by completing the square, our first step is to make sure that the number in front of x squared is a 1. In this case, the number in front of x squared is a 6. So to correct that, we're going to divide everything by 6. So we'll divide each term by 6, including the right-hand side. That leaves us with x squared minus 1/6 x minus 5/6 equals 0. The next step is to make sure that the constant, the number that does not have a variable, is moved to the opposite side from the x values. So what we'll do to fix that is we'll add 5/6. So I'm going to leave a space and then add my 5/6 to the right-hand side. Now the next step in completing the square will be to use that step number 3 from notes, which was half square add. So we're going to take the number that is in front of x, we're going to half it, square it, and add it to both sides. Now, I'm going to go off to the side on the step that says that we need to half it. Since it's a fraction, let's go ahead off to the side and divide 1/6 in half. So we'll go ahead and look at it as negative 1/6 divided by 2. I'm going to think of 2 as 2/1. So again, our next step is to take this x squared minus 1/6 x and add negative 1/6 divided by 2 and square it. So we'll do that to both sides. So over here we're doing the step where we're dividing it in half. We're going to keep the numerator, keep this, change division to multiplication, and then we're going to flip the denominator. So negative 1/6 times 1/2. This will give me negative 1/12. So when we go back to our problem, we have x squared minus 1/6 x plus, and what we have found here inside the parentheses, this simplified to what we had in red over to the right, negative 1/12. So we got to square that number, negative 1/12. Now, what we've noticed in problems in the past is the number that we get before we square it is actually the number that's going to show up in factored form. Again, if I go off to the right, let's go ahead and multiply this out, square that term, I should say. So we end up with 1/144. So we're having to ask ourselves what multiplies to give us 1/144, and at the same time adds to give us negative 1/6, which seems like maybe it would be a difficult task to accomplish, but if we remember, the number before it's squared is the number that's going to show up in our factored form. So if we, just to prove that fact, if we took negative 1/12 and we multiplied it times itself, we're going to find that that's 1/144. But if we took negative 1/12 and we added it to itself, we get negative 2/12, which gives us that negative 1/6. If we look back at our problem, that's what had to add in the center. So we found that negative 1/12 times itself and added to itself gives us the numbers that we needed. So what we'll go back and do is we'll write our factored form using that number, negative 1/12, the number before we squared it. So we have x minus 1/12 squared, when we factor it, is equal to, now we're going to need to figure out what our common denominator is. So when we look at 6 and we look at 144, we need to be able to determine what the common denominator is for those numbers. So if we were to multiply 6 times 24, 6 times 24 would give us 144. It would give us our common denominator. So what we do to the denominator, we'd have to do to the numerator. So we would have 24 times 5 is 120 over 144 plus 1 over 144. This gives us x minus 1/12 squared equals 121 over 144. We're now ready to use the square root property to solve this equation. So we have x minus 1/12. We're going to take the square root to get rid of this squared term, is equal to plus or minus the square root of 121 over the square root of 144. If we simplify that, we get x minus 1/12 is equal to plus or minus 11 over 12. From there, what we would do is we would add 1/12 to both sides. So we have x equals 1/12 plus or minus 11 over 12. So x equals 1/12 plus 11 over 12. X could also equal 1/12 minus 11 over 12. So x is equal to 12 over 12, which gives us x equals 1. And then we have x is equal to negative 10 over 12, which is negative 5 over 6. So there are our two solutions. We're asked to solve by completing the square. In order to solve by completing the square, the number in front of x squared must be a 1. So to correct this, we're going to divide each term by 5. Dividing by 5 is going to create that squared term to become 1x squared. And that's our goal for step number 1. Now, the next thing that we have to do, step number 2, is to move the constant, in our case it's negative 4/5, to the other side away from our x terms. So we'll move our constant over to the right-hand side. Now our next step is going to be the half square add step. We're going to take the number in front of x, this number here, we're going to half it, square it, and add it. So what we're doing is we're taking x squared minus 1/5 x plus negative 1/5 divided in half squared. Okay, so if we were to show this work off to the side, we were actually dividing this number in half, this step of it. We would have negative 1/5 divided by 2. I'm going to look at 2 as 2 over 1 so that I can keep, change, flip. So I keep negative 1/5. I change division to multiplication, and I flip 2 to become 1/2. So I actually end up with negative 1/10. So in my problem, I have x squared minus 1/5 x plus negative 1/10 squared, and then equals 4/5 plus negative 1/10 squared. Now again, if we were to continue through this problem and we were looking at wanting to work towards our next step, which would be to factor the left-hand side, we would have to square that fraction. So we would get 1/100th. So what we're asking ourselves is, what multiplies to give me 1/100th and at the same time adds to give me negative 1/5? Now, we've got a hint within the problem. Every time we solve by completing the square, it's going to work out so that the number before we squared it, in this case negative 1/10, is the number that will show up in our factored answer. So if we look back at this just to prove it to you, if I were to take negative 1/10 and multiply it times itself, I would get a positive 1/100th. That's what we had to multiply to get. Then if I were to take negative 1/10 and add it to itself, I would get negative 2/10, which is negative 1/5. And again, when we are when we are factoring, we've got to multiply to get this number. We saw that here. And we've also got to use the same numbers to add or subtract to get the middle. That's what we've gotten here. So that shows us that we can go back and factor this as x minus 1/10 times x minus 1/10. We'll work with the right-hand side in a minute. This means we can have x minus 1/10 squared. Now, on the right-hand side, we're going to want a common denominator. So we've got to get the denominators to be the same. So if we look at this denominator is 100, this one's 5. I've got to multiply 5 times 20. So that means I've got to multiply the numerator times 20 in order to get a common denominator. So 4 times 20 is going to give us 80. Over 5 times 20 is 100. So we get x minus 1/10 squared equals 81 over 100. We take the square root of both sides to solve this. This is our last step in completing the square. So we get plus or minus the square root of 81 over the square root of 100. So x minus 1/10 is plus or minus 9 over 10. Then we move our 1/10 to the other side, and we split them so that we can finish solving. So we've got 1/10 plus 9/10. That's going to give us 10/10, which is just the number 1. And then we have x equals 1/10 minus 9/10. That's going to give us negative 8/10, which will simplify to negative 4 over 5. So those are our two answers. X is 1 and x is negative 4 over 5. So if we were writing these in a solution set, we would say that we got the answer of negative 4/5 and we got the answer of 1.